Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts project at thunderbolts.info. In recent days, NASA's New Horizons team has released what is the best, closest up image to date of the Kuiper Belt object known as Ultima Thule. This was the subject of a recent Space News, and Wal kind of introduced some of the differences between the mainstream interpretations and predictions for an object like Ultima Thule versus those of the Electric Universe. Now, in this latest picture, the first thing that stands out when looking at this picture is the number of features that look basically identical to features that we see on a lot of objects in the inner solar system, such as asteroids and moons. And that is the number of highly circular craters and what one might call what appear to be chains of craters, although it's not entirely evident because portions of the object are in shadow. And on the smaller of the two lobes that compose Ultima Thule, we see one crater that is absolutely enormous. Now, there's a reason why the New Horizons team is hesitant to talk about possible crater chains and an improbably huge crater on this Kuiper Belt object. Instead, thus far, they are favoring terms like depressions and collapse pits. And the reason for that is you do not expect the kind of high-velocity explosions that impact theory would probably require to produce these features. And of course, the explanation that the New Horizons team has offered for Ultima Thule's double-lobe form is a low-speed collision between two objects in the so-called early solar system, which this traditional story tells us was 4.5 billion years ago. So I'm now going to bring up Wal Thornhill. Wal and I have been discussing this new image over the last couple of days. And so Wal, I think it would be good if we could lay a little bit of groundwork just in case there are any newcomers who have come to this video. Why don't you begin by explaining what some of your thoughts were about Ultima Thule even before the New Horizons spacecraft arrived at the object? And why don't you share what your initial thoughts have been as the images of Ultima Thule have gotten better and better?
Okay, when the New Horizons' newest and best yet view of Ultima Thule appeared on the web, I was struck by just how much it looks like comet nuclei in the inner solar system. Also, it has this neck joining two objects, which is somewhat different from either of the adjoining lobes, as they call them. It's brighter, and if we remember Comet 67P, you saw a sand or some kind of material on that neck region between the two lobes, and it even had what appeared to be sand dunes. Well, the connection between the lobes appears to be something that happens after the lobes have generally been formed, but during the same process. Now, in an earlier Space News, or Seeing Double it was called, I pointed out that in the plasma cosmology view, stars are formed by interstellar Birkeland current filaments inside molecular clouds. In other words, it's a dusty plasma. And we know from research that's been done and published by Don Scott and others that the dust is accumulated much more powerfully into central objects on that filament by the long-range electromagnetic forces involved with electric currents in what you might call lightning bolts inside molecular clouds. I went further a little later and pointed out that all solid objects, all solid bodies, are formed in that same process. There is no need to call upon gravitational accretion, which has never been shown to work. One of the big problems is, even if you have a circulating disk of dust and gas, you have the problem of getting rid of the angular momentum of that disk. There's no reason for the material at the outer edges to fall in towards the center once it achieves a certain velocity of rotation about that center. So I expected, on the basis of also the recent history of the solar system, that the bodies in the outer solar system would show all of the same features as those seen in the inner solar system. Because, to put it simply, the solar system is a blended family of objects that have been captured by the sun after the formation of the sun. It had nothing to do with leftovers from the sun. And this explains all of the mysteries about isotopic compositions and the differences between the planets, because our solar system, if you look at it dispassionately without the gravitational theory as a lens, a distorting lens, it's a fruit salad of objects. They're all different. They have different axial tilts, and their rotation rates are hard to explain. The angular momentum of the whole system is hard to explain on the gravitational theory. And they exhibit behavior, magnetic fields, and weather patterns which are still unexplained. Given all of these facts, and when you realize that you're looking through every space shot that's been sent up to tell us how the solar system was formed, is viewed through this distorting lens of gravitational accretion. So Ultima Thule was a big test, really, because I'd already predicted that this would be the case, that objects even in the outer solar system would tend to be formed in pairs, sometimes joined during the process of formation. It's interesting to look at the language of the reports of the closest up image yet of this object, because the language has changed. It's an indication of cognitive dissonance. In other words, what they're seeing doesn't match what they expected. When I saw it, the first thing that struck me was the circular crater on the smaller lobe, which is facing towards us. And one of the key aspects of electrical scarring is circular cratering. With no debris in the crater, it looks as though it's been machined. And also, there is a propensity for the discharge as it fades to switch to other high points near the central crater. And of course, the nearest high point on a crater is the rim. And you'll notice there are at least 3 that I can see, smaller circular craters perched on the rim of that larger crater. Now, I'm calling it a crater, but the language in the report says the large circular feature, about 4 miles or 7 kilometers across, on the smaller of the 2 lobes, appears to be a deep depression. Of course, the reason why they use the words deep depression is that for a crater to have occurred, it means that the collision must have been at high speed. And as we've said, the whole idea behind the standard model of trying to explain this object is low speed collisions, 5 kilometers an hour or less, the sort of bump in a parking lot. That just doesn't work with a crater that size.
Right.
4 miles across, 7 kilometers across, that requires an impact which should have shattered the object. Because remember, these are supposed to be ices and dust that have been accreted from a very thinly dispersed cloud of dust and gas. Right. You do not expect an object to form that is solid enough to receive an impact like that and survive. And what's more, at that distance from the sun, the orbital speed is very low, and any other objects that are following the same orbit will only have minor differences in speed. And this is why they talk about a bump in a parking lot.
Right.
Because the analogy is fairly accurate based on the gravitational model. But what we see has nothing to do with low-speed collisions. And what's more, impact craters themselves are an assumption, because in the gravitational theory, the only way to form craters like that is with impact. You're very limited in what you can actually explain with impacts. No one has actually observed the before and after of a celestial impact of sufficient size to create a crater that size. So this is all mere speculation, or maybe just a story, a cover story, to hide our fundamental ignorance.
Right. Well, we should mention that this crater, what we're calling a crater, that we see on the smaller lobe of Ultima Thule, this is not the first instance when we've seen an object in our solar system with a crater that is so huge that it would have destroyed the body if it was caused by a kinetic impact. If you look at some of the moons of Saturn, Mimas and Tethys are the most dramatic examples. If you look at the Martian moon Phobos and Stickney crater, and if you look at the asteroid Vesta, in all of these instances, you see craters which astronomers themselves admit should have shattered the body if they were caused by mechanical collisions and high-velocity explosions.
That's correct. The other evidence for electrical scarring are the small, regular, circular pits on the larger lobe. At the top of the image that I'm looking at that was published, you can see there are 3 small circular pits in a row. And in fact, there's a couple of smaller ones heading up towards the top of the lobe. But then almost in the shadow region at the top, you see another chain of craters. There's at least 4 there, and they may actually continue across the shadow to meet up with another one on the far side. Now, crater chains are electrical formations. There's no other explanation for them. In the inner solar system, the story went that an incoming bolide fractured more or less in space before it hit under the gravitational influence of the body that it was impacting. And they sort of splattered across the face of that object. But that doesn't explain the circularity, the fact that one crater doesn't disturb the other. And there's no fill from one crater that happened after another. So the electrical theory is, I submit, the only theory which can explain these features. And in fact, it's one explanation for all of the observations, not special dispensations for different bodies simply because they don't fit the pattern.
Right.
All of the strange features, including the craters on the moon and the raid craters and all of that, was explained by Ralph Jurgens back in the 1970s in a brilliant series of articles on the electrical scarring of the moon and Mars. You could then extend his work without making any other ad hoc assumptions to all of the bodies we've seen since then.
Well, I think this actually might be a good point to just take a moment and examine some of the recent discoveries that we've reported here on Space News, which relate very directly to this question of our solar system's history and origins. So obviously, as one expects, the New Horizons team is holding to this traditional idea of a solar system that formed from a gravitationally collapsing nebular cloud, and this happened 4.5 billion years ago. And the only process they can imagine forming an object like Ultima Thule is gravitational accretion. And yet, the real question I have is why any of these assumptions continue to endure, since, as we have reported, there are more problems and anomalies for the nebular hypothesis than there are successes. And we report routinely on discoveries which planetary scientists admit, it's not us saying this, it's planetary scientists who say, that these discoveries can't be reconciled with the solar system's conventional history and origins. So just very quickly, bear with me, I'll give just a few examples. Last year, we reported on the discovery of the so-called Hypatia stone, which is a meteorite fragment that was discovered in a glass field in Libya, and which is composed of this, quote, weird matrix of minerals, which planetary scientists admit they can't explain. And the reason they can't explain it is the meteorite is supposed to have originated from a homogeneous primordial dust cloud. And also late last year, planetary scientists discovered that there's a group of asteroids near Neptune which actually appear to be identical to asteroids that are close to Jupiter, which are so-called sun-baked asteroids. So here's a quick excerpt from a Scientific American piece on that discovery. The Neptunian asteroids are so far from the sun that their surfaces should have stayed almost pristine since birth, scarcely altered by our nearest star's warming rays. And yet they appear remarkably similar to a group of sun-baked asteroids near Jupiter. These puzzling observations, asteroids that look nothing like their putative parents in the sedate solar hinterlands, but strongly resemble their supposed relatives that have been toasted by the sun, call into question scientists' best theories for the origin and evolution of the solar system. Then more recently, you did a brilliant presentation on the discovery that water in Saturn's rings and on its moons is apparently identical to water in Earth's oceans. And as you reported, this was actually a confirmation of an outrageous prediction that Velikovsky made, which was that Saturn was the source of our planet's water. So here's a quote from a phys.org report. It says the results, quote, mean we need to change models of the formation of the solar system because the new results are in conflict with existing models. And finally, speaking of historic space missions to supposedly primordial objects in the solar system, scientists with the Rosetta mission to 67P recently admitted that the comet cannot be billions of years old. Now, in the early published findings on the mission, Rosetta scientists proposed that, like Ultima Thule, the double-lobed nucleus of 67P was formed by a low-speed collision of two objects in the early solar system. But based on the scientists' numerical calculations, it was determined that the nucleus would have crumbled or disintegrated countless eons ago, and therefore it is only millions of years old rather than billions. So among the other problems the comet scientists have faced, they have to try to explain the, quote, geological features we see, which includes complexly layered stratified rock, which is absolutely everywhere on the comet nucleus. And further, there's the problem of how do you form a comet only millions of years ago rather than billions of years? Well, here's what they came up with. Two fully formed comet nuclei in the late solar system experienced a violent high-velocity collision and exploded. And then after the comets exploded, as you can see in the computer animation the scientists created, even though the material would have been accelerated to tremendous velocities and in a near-zero gravitational sphere of influence, we're told that rather than dispersing, a portion of the destroyed material recoalesced and kept recoalescing and kept recoalescing to form 67P as we see it today. And now I don't think I need to belabor why this particular conjecture is, and this is just my opinion, the closest thing to impossible. But here are 2 points to consider. Number one, we see two very different hypotheses being offered for the creation of the respective double-lobed forms of Ultima Thule and 67P. Even though they both involve collisions, with Ultima Thule it's a low-speed collision 4.5 billion years ago, and with 67P it's a violent explosion only millions of years ago. And again, the process that's actually forming the comet is a recoalescing of material that has been destroyed. But in the case of the electric universe, as Wal has already explained, we see a consistent, coherent explanation for the, quote, doubling effect at all scales throughout the entire cosmos. As you can see on screen, this is quite evident in the comparison of both 67P and Ultima Thule to a portion of hematite that was blasted with an electric arc. So the question I have to ask critics of the electric universe theory is, do you care that all of the discoveries I just described were either explicitly predicted by the electric universe, or are exactly what one does expect if our solar system experienced the kind of recent upheaval the electric universe proposes? So, Wal, what are your thoughts?
Yes, it's system-wide, this problem. It's rather ironic that Velikovsky was more or less pilloried for suggesting that the solar system had changed within the memory of the earliest human beings. And now the favored theory for a lot of these unexpected discoveries is that the planets, particularly the gas giants, must have migrated. So in other words, their orbits have changed. But of course, it has to have happened billions of years ago. And that's one of the aspects that's never really addressed psychologically in cosmology, is that the theories appear to have to make us feel safe. In fact, the Australian philosopher David Stove wrote that Newton's theory was designed to make sure that nothing untoward happened in the solar system.
Right.
This idea of a clockwork solar system that was wound up 4.5 billion years ago and has functioned fairly undisturbed, apart from a few showers of objects that are used to explain ad hoc the fact that we have a moon and there are craters on objects. But all of this happened way in the distant past, so we don't have to worry about that.
Right.
And of course, this continues today. So there is a kind of almost a religious grip on the gravitational accretion over huge spans of time theory. Velikovsky really threw down a gauntlet which no astronomer has been willing to pick up. And that was, of course, the origin, really, of the electric universe, because scholars could see that there was a case to be answered, and some remarkable people came forward and began picking up that challenge and piecing it together. And I was very pleased to actually have joined them a little later in the piece, as it turns out. But nevertheless, I think it's been effective because the groundwork is very solid. And there's been no ad hocery required to explain all of these weird discoveries in space. In fact, we've been able to predict a lot of them.